This lecture introduced new concepts and reviews a few old concepts.
The first topic we're going to talk about is solid waste. We can either throw solid waste into a landfill or incinerate it. The positives for incinerators is it's going to create a smaller volume of waste. This will be very beneficial for a place like New York City where they don't have a lot of land.
There are two main cons. One, it's going to produce air pollution. We can filter some of it out, but not all of it. Second, the ash that's left behind is going to be more toxic than the waste itself.
The alternative is a landfill.
Some positives for landfills is it's cheap and easy. Some negatives, well, you need a lot of land to do this. The two biggest ones, however, are leachate and methane. Leachate is anything that will dissolve in water and seep down to the bottom. The best way I can describe this is all of that liquid water at the bottom of your trash can or dumpster. That is basically a leachate. Methane gas is produced when bacteria break down organic matter. The problem with methane gas is that it can seep through the ground and enter people's basements. Methane gas is odorless and colorless, so humans can't detect it very easily. It's also very flammable, so if somebody lights a cigarette or lights a stove on fire, that's enough to cause an explosion in the house.
So here's a diagram of a modern landfill. Down here we have a protective liner, usually made of clay. That way the leachate won't sink down and enter the groundwater system. They have a pipe that goes down the bottom of the landfill, and they'll pump out the leachate and store it in a plant. They also have other pipes going down into the ground to help release the methane gas. There are two options for liquid waste. We can either put a liquid waste into a septic tank or wastewater treatment plant. They both use bacteria to break down organic matter. Septic tanks will do this underground. Wastewater will do this above ground. The problem with septic tanks is if there's a hole in the tank, that sewage can enter groundwater, which somebody downstream can then use that groundwater as their drinking water. Fecal coli can form in the sewage water and can cause serious illness. Wastewater treatment plants do something similar. They use bacteria again to break down the sewage, and before they're done, they'll add chemicals such as chlorine to clean up any other bacteria and dump it back into a stream. Somebody downstream then can be using that water as their drinking water. Okay, so here's a quick diagram on septic tanks. When you flush a toilet or let water go down the drain, it's going to empty your septic tank. The bigger stuff is going to sink down to the bottom. This sludge needs to be pumped out every 10 years or so. So if you're going to buy a house in the future, you need to check to make sure when the last time the septic tank was pumped. The rest of the stuff here is where bacteria is going to eat a lot of the organic matter. The rest is going to flow out and enter drainage fields, and then it'll slowly sink down into the ground. The ground will continue to filter it out. Eventually, that's going to go down into a groundwater system and continue downstream. The cool thing is that somebody downstream might actually be pumping that up in their well and using it in their houses. Wastewater treatment plants do something similar. First, it's going to have a screen, it's going to catch bigger stuff. Then it's going to allow some gravity to sink down to the bottom. They're going to pump some of that scum out and use that for fertilizer. They're going to send it through a series of tanks to allow bacteria to consume a lot of the organic matter. Then they'll add chemicals such as chlorine and dump it back into a stream. And then downstream, somebody might be using that water as their drinking water. The next topic we're going to talk about is food. We can either get food through farming or through grazing livestock. So first, farming. Some negative effects are we're going to have a loss of habitat. The entire northeast United States used to be one big massive forest. When the humans came and settled, we tore down a lot of the forest to make room for our fields. When we did that, we're going to have lots of erosion. Roots of the plants are actually going to hold the soil in place. So if we tear up the trees, the roots are no longer going to be there to hold the soil in place. We'll also get lots of nitrates and phosphates from fertilizers entering streams, which can cause eutrophication and dead zones downstream. Pesticides will also enter the stream, which is a bad thing, especially if we're using the streams for our drinking water. Some pros, well, a good thing is we get food, and a big one is it takes a lot less energy to grow food than it does to grow animals. Take, for example, corn versus a cow. It'll take one season to grow a whole field of corn, and you have food at the end of that season. For a cow, however, we have to grow 10 years worth of corn to feed that cow to allow it to grow to adulthood. So it takes a lot less energy to grow fruit and vegetables than it does animals. There are a couple of things we can do to slow down the negative effects. One is contour plowing. Contour plowing is plowing along contour lines, so this would mean plowing across the hill instead of up the hill. Whenever it rains, then the crops will slow down the water and slow down the rate of erosion. Integrated pest management uses other methods to control pests. One example would be there's a caterpillar that likes to eat a lot of the crops. So instead of spreading pesticides to eat the caterpillar, we can introduce a wasp that will actually sting the caterpillars and inject their eggs into the caterpillars. The eggs then will grow into larvae and eat the caterpillars from the inside out. The wasp does no harm to the crops, but it kills the caterpillars. We can also plant riparian buffers along streams. This will slow down the rate of erosion near the streams, and the plants will also soak up extra nitrates and phosphates and fertilizers before it enters the streams. Best management plan is to use a variety of these methods to control a lot of the cons. No-till farming. Tilling is when you ground up the land at the end of the season and plow it. No-till farming, you won't till it. You just cut the tops of the plants off and leave the stem and the roots to help slow down erosion. So here's an example of contour plowing. They're going across the hill instead of up the hill. So whenever it rains, these rows of crops will slow down the water and slow down erosion. Here's no-till farming. So here's a row of old crops. You can see they cut just the top off and they left the root. The following year they plant right next to it, and the third year they'll plant next to that. Here's an example of a stream near Lidditz that has a riparian buffer. Here's the before picture of the stream. You see lots of erosion, not a whole lot of vegetation. Here's the after picture after the riparian buffer was added. Lots of vegetation to soak up a lot of the nitrates and phosphates, and this also slows down the rate of erosion. Next up is a little talk on livestock. Some pros, well, we also get food from livestock, so that's a good thing. The food that the livestock provides also provides us with protein, which is essential to our diet. And livestock sometimes isn't quite as affected by severe weather as plants might be. One example of just this year, there was a big drought. The problem was the drought was so big that a lot of the plants were dying, therefore we didn't have enough food to feed the cattle, and now the cattle are starting to die. So the animals are affected by the drought, but it was second to the plants. Some cons for livestock, we often get lots of overgrazing. This is when too many animals are on the land. When you have too many animals on the land, you get a lot more erosion, and you have desertification. Desertification, when the erosion is so high that plant seeds are unable to stay there long enough to grow roots. Therefore, the whole area looks like a desert because nothing will grow. We also have a loss of habitat. Again, we're cutting down forests to make room for our livestock. Another con is that it takes more energy to grow animals and plants. Think back to my corn versus a cow example. Restoration, we can limit the amount of livestock so we don't get overgrazing, and we can also add riparian buffers. So here's an example of an area getting overgrazed. If it gets overgrazed too much, we get desertification. You see there's no vegetation on the ground, because every time any seeds might get laid down, the ground is too hard for the roots to take in, and anytime it rains, those seeds will get washed away. Native species versus invasive species. Native species are plants or animals that belong in an area. They originate from that area, they belong there. Invasive species is an animal plant that does not belong or originate from a specific area. One example from around here would be bamboo. Bamboo is not typically grown here. Some people will plant it and then they find out it's very hard to get rid of because it's an invasive species. A lot of invasive species are bad because they have no natural predators, so their population just goes out of control. A popular invasive species right now is the stink bug. A lot of people hate the stink bugs because their population's going out of control because there's no natural predators for this area. The stink bug originally originated from Asia. When it came over here, there's just nothing that eats them, so their population keeps growing and growing and growing.
The next little mini topic we're going to talk about is building material, wood versus stone. If you're going to make your buildings out of wood, you're going to have to deforest the land to get the wood. If you're going to make it out of stone, you're going to have to mine an area to get the stone. So first, deforestation. Some good things for building buildings out of wood would be it's cheaper, it's easier to get to the wood versus stone, and it can be considered a renewable resource. If we replace the trees in a timely manner, it's considered renewable. Some cons would be loss of habitat. Again, you're cutting down the trees, and because you're cutting down the trees and getting rid of the roots, you're going to have lots more of erosion. Okay, so some restoration practices. We have selective cutting and reforestation. Selective cutting means only cutting the larger trees. This will leave some of the smaller trees behind, which will allow the forest to regenerate much more quickly, and will also allow for some areas for the animals to nest and continue to have a small population there. It's going to hugely limit the population, but allow some of the population to remain there. And it'll also slow down erosion. However, it is going to be harder for the lumber companies to get to the trees. They're going to have to build more roads, which will be more costly. Reforestation means they're going to have to replant trees that they cut down. Companies are required to do that in the United States. The problem, however, is they're required to replace the trees they cut down, but not necessarily the same trees. So the deforestation companies are going to usually pick the cheapest tree to replant. So if they're cutting down 20 different species of trees, they may only replace it with 1 or 2 different types of species. So this will drastically decrease the amount of biodiversity in the ecosystem, which is not a very good thing. The ecosystem will not be very stable in the long run, and certain animals and other plants that depend on the species that have gone, their population is not going to be able to come back either. So it's better than doing nothing, but it's still not the greatest. Here's an example of clear cutting. You just go on the hillside and cut every tree down. Here's an example of selective cutting. You still have some of the smaller trees available. All the bigger trees, you can see the stumps, have been taken away. So the forest is very open. You're going to get lots more of erosion. There's definitely a lot fewer places for animals to live. But there's at least something there to help reboot the ecosystem. Okay, so if you're going to make buildings out of stone, you have to mine. It's nice to make buildings out of stone. While they're not flammable, they're typically more durable, depending on what type of stone you're using. However, it's going to be more expensive for the homeowner to build a house out of stone. Also, you're going to have loss of habitat again. You're going to cut down habitat to make a big hole in the ground. You're going to have a lot more of erosion, and you're going to have acid runoff. When the rocks are exposed and it rains, that the rainwater will then turn into acidic runoff. This will have a lot of havoc in streams, that because it's going to lower the pH, and a lot of the plants and animals in the streams will then go through acid shock and die. Restoration, we can reclaim the land. So companies, if feasible, they're going to basically cover up the hole that they make. They're going to put a bunch of rocks into it, then they're going to fill it with soil, and then you're going to add some plants and stuff to regenerate the ecosystem. This isn't always done, especially mines that are on a hillside. It's very hard to restore that area because erosion would just slide everything down off the hill again. But this can be done with open pit mining. So here's an example of an open pit mine. When they're done, they could essentially fill this whole layer up with rocks and then put a layer of topsoil on top and plant plants. That would be an example of restoration. Here, this brown water is a picture showing the acid runoff coming off of a mine. This concludes the lecture on humans and the earth.